Even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. As such, it deserves no compassion, it deserves no treatment as minority martyrdom, and it deserves not to be deemed anything but a pernicious sickness. That's from Time magazine in 1966, when I was 3 years old. And last year, the President of the United States came out in favor of gay marriage.
So, I thought that was a really powerful video to start off with, and I'd like to think that neuroscience helped to get us from what he heard from Time magazine back in the 60s to where we are now, that gay marriage is now legal. So what we're going to do in this section is we're going to talk about the neuroscience findings. But I get a lot asked in my face-to-face classes a lot, Amy, are you going to say that that being gay is absolutely biological? And I also teach an entire class on sexuality. And so this is always a big question, and absolutely not. I start out my classes by saying, if you want answers on sexual orientation, I probably don't have many to give you. And one of the reasons why I don't have many to give you is because it's very difficult for me to even truly define sexual orientation. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So here, what is their sexual orientation? Sandra is a female prostitute. She engages in sex with men on a regular basis. However, in her personal life, she's completely in love with Janet. So here's an example where we see somebody engaging in sexual behavior that would be heterosexual, but it seems like she is actually in love with somebody of the same sex. Here's another one. Lester had numerous sexual encounters with women, which he enjoyed prior to going to prison. However, in prison, he engages in sex acts with men on a regular basis, which he also enjoys. So the question here is if he never went to prison, would he ever engage in sex acts with men? What's going to happen to him when he gets out of prison? Is he going to go back to women? Is he going to enjoy both? Do we even really care? So on and so forth. Mike dresses in women's clothes and works occasionally as a transvestite prostitute on Sunset Boulevard. However, he states that he's primarily attracted to women. So again, it seems like him dressing, having the transvestic fetishism, is causing him to want to act the full role, but he's not really attracted to these men. It's part of the kind of role fantasy that he's playing out. So this is why I say, am I going to say that all sexual orientation is absolutely biological? No, I can't say that because it's too broad of a category and we don't have nice little boxes that we can put people in. Everybody's sexual orientation varies in many different shades of gray. So this is Kinsey's continuum. I don't believe that I'll be asking you about this on the test, but I'm sure many of you have already been exposed to this, but I think it's important before we look at the biological factors that, again, I reinforce my notion that sexual orientation is not something that can be broken down to it's just this or it's just that. There's so many factors involved. So a zero would be someone that's exclusively heterosexual, that is never engaged in any homosexual relations, which, by the way, 25% of all men have reached the point of ejaculation through a homosexual encounter, according to the most recent National Life Health Survey. A one would be somebody that has had a homosexual relationship, but maybe it was just in childhood or maybe adolescence, or it could have been just a one-time thing. It was just one person. Here, though, a two would be somebody. What we find with sexual orientation is for a lot of us, it changes just for a couple years. So, some people just find one person that they have a relationship with, but all the rest of their life, they are primarily heterosexual. Like, for example, the Leicester prison one might be that might be an example. Maybe he was gay because those were his only opportunities in prison, and so it was caused by the environmental circumstances. However, we do know that there's a lot of men that go to prison and under no circumstances, even though they're in there for 20 years, will they ever engage in homosexual behavior? So this is what I'm trying to show you is that we seem to have different degrees of sexual orientation, and along with different degrees of sexual orientation, there's probably personality factors involved of how much are we willing to experiment and how much are we changeable. There's some people that are probably more just set in their way, one way or another, and then there's others of us that like to experiment with new things and change things. I remember being like I had never thought about personality interacting with sexual orientation, but it kind of makes sense that some of us, like, why not? Why don't we try different things? And then there's others of us that say absolutely not, and that would play a role. So a three is somebody which is a true bisexual, and a lot of people don't seem to understand this sexual orientation. The homosexual community says, oh, you just want to keep your options open, you're really homosexual, you can't make up your mind. And then the heterosexual community is also kind of saying the same thing. But what a lot of us don't seem to be able to really grasp is that a true bisexual says it doesn't matter what genitals they have. It's, I'm attracted to both equally. I like to think of it that, as it's kind of the most logical way to be when you really think logically. Like, why should it matter what the flap of skin is between our legs? Why is that what we solely determine? Like, can I be attracted to you or can't I be attracted to you? Because there's such a broad range of gender too. There's, many women that seem to have many more masculine qualities, and there's many men that have more feminine qualities. And why should we limit ourselves to what's between their legs, which we know is set up by hormones during basically the first trimester of pregnancy? So this three says it truly doesn't matter which way, and I'm attracted to either. So a lot of people think, oh, they have to swing between the sexes in order to be happy. So a true bisexual, if they're with a man, then eventually they're going to have to be with a woman. And that's not true either. So a lot of us want to put people in boxes again as you're gay or you are heterosexual. But there's a true orientation where they say, I'm not either. So a four is somebody who's they define themselves as homosexual, but they have experimented with the opposite sex more than once. They have had relationships with the opposite sex, so more than incidentally heterosexual. A five is somebody who says, I'm homosexual, but I did try. I did try being with someone of the opposite sex, but it didn't work out for me. And then there's certain people that are exclusively homosexual that they say, no, I knew I was gay from day one. I don't have any desire to be with the opposite sex. So let's talk about whoops, sorry about that. Let's talk about statistics that was found by Kinsey. So Kinsey, he was a sex researcher, and he started out as he was actually a WASP researcher. Uh, and Then they asked him to teach a marriage and family class, and he started doing the research on sex, and he's like, there's nothing out here. What is out here? So he decided that he was going to do a survey across the nation, where he was going to interview people, and he interviewed people for 2 hours at a time, and he was very rigorous. And I mean, he really tried to do the most scientifically rigorous survey that he could possibly do on sexuality. And with that, he tried to include many different facets of society. And one criticism that he got was he had too many prisoners in his study. So when we look at these statistics, a lot of people will say they're a little bit off, and I'll try to show you where they were. So 4 to 6 men were rated as a 6. So that's about right. A lot of people think that, oh, 10% of the population is gay. That's not the statistics that we have. It's approximately 4% of the population identifies themselves as, you know, uh, being lifestyle, living the life of absolutely defining themselves as being gay. Now, this 10%, where we say 10% of the population is gay, we can see where that comes in. There are 4 or 5 or 6, maybe. But again, he's been criticized that his population had too many prisoners, and that might account for it, because this 37% right here of all men experience orgasm and sexual activity with another man at some time in their life, we feel that that is too high. As I said, the National Life Health Survey that we have, that's pretty recent, that's the one that we are using now, is saying about 25%. 60% of all men had some type of homosexual relationship before they were age 16. Wow, that's huge, huh? 30% of all men had some type of homosexual relationship between 20 and 24. So that's pretty big. And again, I'm showing you why I can't give you clear-cut answers about sexual orientation, because when you contrast this number with the number of men that actually, with the number of people, because that's not all men, it's men and women, define themselves as being homosexual, that's only 4% of the population. Okay, so let's move on. So, one thing that I'll try to talk about some statements that people make about sexual orientation, um, where they say, "Oh, homosexuality is not natural." And for those of you that haven't been exposed to this information, it might interest you to know that I can give you at least 300 different species that have been found to exhibit homosexual behavior. Now, the criticism of this is that many times you don't find lifelong homosexual behavior, but we're going to find out that sheep have been studied extensively, and some of these neurological differences that have been found between the homosexual and heterosexual male brain also is found in the sheep. So we'll be watching a video in just a little bit where they go over this again. These penguins right here are a really cute story. This is Roy and Silo, and these two male penguins, the zookeeper knew that they were gay. There had been many years where they had tried to actually incubate a rock. So penguins pair bond, and the female sits on the egg and hatches the egg. So at one point, the zookeeper decided he found an extra egg. There was an egg, and it was just going to die, and he knew these two penguins had been trying to incubate the rock. So they actually, this pair of penguins, they actually were given the egg, and they had a baby, Tango, and they raised him. I think Tango might be a girl. You could look it up. This was in the New York Zoo, in a zoo that was in New York. And they raised the little chick together, and it was, it made headlines. I know eventually they split apart, and one of them, I can't remember if it was Roy or Silo, eventually went to be with a female penguin, and the other one did not. So again, these ranges of sexual orientation even is presented in animals. Okay, so this looks a little bit like it's cut off. I apologize for that. Let's see. Okay. Well, I'm taking this particular PowerPoint. I'm trying to go along straight with the book because I feel like there's so many things that I take from my sexuality book that I don't want to get you guys confused at this time in the semester. But I'll just read off these. Genetic and biological predisposition appears to be weaker for women. So again, I have this really cute video that I want to show you, and even in the video, it talks about how there's not as much research on women. So there's a couple factors why we don't find these same brain differences with lesbians. One thing that we know about female sexual behavior is that it's much more fluid than men. There's so much differentiation in the way women seem to express their behavior. I could show you a video where actually they hook women up to machines and men up to machines, and they show them sexually explicit material. And for example, a heterosexual man, when he's shown gay porn, he doesn't experience an erection. When you show him animal sexual behavior, he doesn't have an erection. He doesn't get any sexual arousal except to basically the heterosexual porn. Women, on the other hand, they report consciously that they don't get any sexual arousal to animal sex, gay, gay male porn, lesbian porn, regular porn. They will say that they don't have that. But then when you look at the readings down in the machine, we see that women do seem to get unconsciously sexually aroused by a huge variety of stimuli. So women consciously and unconsciously seem to be not as quite locked in, and that could be one of the reasons. Another thing is that lesbians in general aren't as much in the sciences. They don't usually have as much money, and they're not as verbal and vocal as the male homosexual population. So there's not as much research on lesbianism. So a lot of homosexual research came from homosexual men who were in the sciences. And when you have two men living together, they tend to have more money because there's not as many children involved. Men still earn a little bit more than women, so on and so forth. So now contrast that with women. There aren't as many women in science. I would believe it's probably about a 4-to-1 ratio. And then that there's less lesbians than there are actually homosexual males, and that lesbians don't seem to have the access to the same amount of funding as homosexual males is another factor, maybe why we're finding this, and maybe there's more research that we'll find in the future. Okay, so here's one that always throws my students for a loop is I actually give them a true and false quiz in class of kind of all these myths and so on and so forth. I'm not doing that to you guys, but I'm just going to kind of go over them. And one of my questions says, gender nonconformity in childhood is a relatively strong predictor of sexual orientation in the future. And they all say, no, no, Amy, that's not true. And then I show them the research and I say, yes, we do find that homosexual boys are less likely to engage in rough and tumble play, and lesbian girls are more likely to be engaged in very tomboy-like behavior. But again, we see that the childhood play is a greater predictor of male homosexuality than it is of female homosexuality. Okay, so then it says higher percentage of women acknowledge physical attraction to both sexes and switch between sexual orientation. We're back to women's sexuality seems to be more fluid than men. That's been shown on so many different levels. This was something that was talked about in the book. I won't ask you this on the test, but I thought it was interesting enough to include in this is they found subtle average behavioral and anatomical differences between heterosexuals and homosexuals, which they found a greater average height and weight in heterosexual men. So heterosexual men tend to be a little bit taller, a little way more. And then this is an interesting one. When you ask women to give directions, they usually use landmarks, like you turn at the McDonald's and then you're going to go past the mall and then you're going to go here, you're going to end up here. Whereas men might say you turn right, drive for a mile, then you're going to go left and it's going to be about 5 miles and then you'll be at the destination. We find that homosexual men also tend to use landmarks more in their directions. Anyway, not part of the test, but interesting. Okay, so studies of twins suggest sexual orientation is influenced by genetic factors. Again, we're going to see a little video, and this video is going to say that if you're identical twins, then you have a 70% concordance rate. However, your textbook is going to say, says 50%. So the odds that you are gay are very small. However, if you have identical twin that is gay, you have a 50% chance of also being gay. No particular gene has been identified. Several genes may have an influence. And I even have another short video that would show you some interesting information of why you might see differences between uh, identical twin brothers. This was a picture that was taken directly from your textbook. I'll let you take a look at it for a minute, but you definitely can find it in your textbook, and you've probably already spent some time looking at it. Okay, so here's another thing. So one thing I'd like you to know about neurological findings about sexual orientation is I want you to know that the concordance rate between twins, identical twins, is much higher than fraternal twins. So there is evidence of biological factors with our twin studies. So that's an important point. Another point that I'd like you to know is if you're going, where we're finding the genes seems to be on the X chromosome. So you wouldn't look in the father's history, you would look in the mother's history as far as the genetics that might be involved in the development of homosexuality. And I think it's interesting that the book kind of really went into that these genes on the X chromosome may offer benefits to women as far as their reproductive strategies, but when it goes to the boys, it may influence sexual orientation. Here's all of that type of information that I'm talking about, that they did talk about in the book. I'm not going to focus on that on the test. However, it is an interesting thing for you to read about. My focus is going to be that if I asked you where we're finding the genes, if there are genes for sexual orientation, it would be on the mother's side, the X chromosome. Okay, here's an important point. So we don't find that sexual orientation is related to adult hormone levels, which would be more the activating effects. So homosexual men and women tend to have the same hormonal levels as far as testosterone and estrogen as heterosexuals. So we're not finding that in the adult hormone levels. When we're talking about hormone levels in the womb, when we're talking about hormone levels, we're definitely talking about in the womb. And we're going to find out that the first trimester was all for genitals. And now the second trimester seems to be differentiating, the hypothalamus. Okay. Another thing, again, that's going to be brought home with this short little video clip that I show you in a few minutes is an interesting fact that the probability of homosexual orientation is also higher among men with older brothers. So I feel like the video that I'm going to show you has a nice representation of this. But basically, a woman has to wash a baby in testosterone, and the baby boy seems to be like foreign. It's a foreign type of cells that are in her body. And so they feel like the more boys that a woman has, the more her immunity system seems to react against the boy and doesn't allow the masculizing process to happen. And so they are finding that if a woman has a bunch of boys, which actually I have 5 boys, and so if there was any prediction of which one is most likely to be gay, it would be the last boy, because supposedly my body would be more and more, get more and more efficient at fighting against a boy baby, or my testosterone washing may get weaker and weaker. They're not quite sure which. And so the baby may end up with a more feminized hypothalamus. Another interesting one is what they did was they found men that were gay that they identified themselves as gay, and they called their mothers up and they asked their mothers about their pregnancies, each one of their pregnancies. And without any prompting, they found that women of homosexual men were approximately 5 times more likely to report a very stressful pregnancy with the child that grew up to be gay. And this is some biological reasons as to why stress during the second trimester may increase the chances of developing a homosexual orientation. Prenatal exposure to stress and alcohol may play a role. Stress releases endorphins. This seems to antagonize the effects of testosterone on the hypothalamus. It also elevates the adrenal hormone cortisone, which decreases the testosterone release. So what's going to masculinize the part of the brain that they suspect is responsible for sexual orientation is testosterone. And so something that would interfere with the testosterone may interrupt this process. So you could have male genitals, but the boy is XY chromosome. He has male genitalia, but then there was stress during this time period and it inhibited the masculinization of the hypothalamus. There's been other research again. The main point is I'm showing you things that I took directly from the textbook to support this hypothesis. But the main thing to take away from this is that something that has been found to play a role maybe in the prenatal development of sexual orientation would be stress during the second trimester. Okay, so we've been talking about this. The homosexual brain is shifted towards the opposite sex in some, but not always. There's a great picture that your textbook has where it shows female areas that are larger and male areas that are larger. This final statement is talking about that we are not sure. At this point, we are not sure. Were these structures a different size at birth, or were they just a minimal size different at birth, and then the behaviors actually altered the size of the structure later on in life? Okay. So the main area that I want to focus on that we see that are difference between homosexual males and heterosexual males is the INA3. It's the third interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus, number 3. We're not going to focus as much on this, the larger anterior commissure and suprachiasmatic nucleus, but if I was to ask you, where have we found differences between homosexual and heterosexual men's brain, it should be the interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus, number 3. And I believe I have a picture to show you that. Yeah, here we go. So here is it as a larger structure, and here it is as a smaller structure. So this structure would be symbolic more of women, and the homosexual men. This would be symbolic of the heterosexual men. So as you can see, there's a pretty big size difference. Another interesting thing that your textbook is not talking about is I have talked to you guys about pheromones, which are these chemicals that are released in the air, and they kind of may influence who we're attracted to. And so we know that that's a completely unconscious process. And what they do find is they find that gay men are attracted to the pheromones of men. They are not attracted to female pheromones. And whereas heterosexual men are attracted to female pheromones. So that's working at a completely unconscious process. So again, are they choosing this? Is this something that just happened because of this? We keep finding over and over that your sexual orientation is an integral part of who you are. Okay. So here we go. We're talking about stress during the second trimester. An interesting one is a study in 1995 interviewed women who were exposed prenatally to a miscarriage drug, and they found a higher incidence of lesbianism and bisexuality. So we found a lot of information that hormones may influence male homosexuality, but here's a study where we actually found a drug seeming to influence female homosexuality. Okay, here we already talked about in childhood, gays and lesbians tend to report less gender and stereotypical play. So we had talked about that a little bit earlier. And then here, I'm focusing again on what are we supposed to take away from brain factors that may be involved in sexual orientation. And again, I'm reinforcing this, the interstitial nucleus of the hypothalamus, number 3. One other thing, as you saw on other slides, there's other smaller areas. And when we talked about chapter 14, we talked about the corpus callosum differences, that women have a 10% thicker corpus callosum. We find that same thing with homosexual men. So as a recap here, let's just make sure that we kind of are getting this. During the first trimester, we think that testosterone seems to masculinize the genitals. So if you have an XY chromosome and everything goes all in accordance, then you get male genitals. Then during the second trimester of pregnancy, the testosterone comes in and washes again, and it may change the size of these different brain structures like the corpus callosum, the interstitial nucleus number 3 of the hypothalamus. And then finally, what we're going to get to in next segment is we're going to talk about transsexuality. And we're going to see that the cortex is the testosterone comes in and washes the cortex again. So what you're going to see in the next one is a lot of us have empathy for somebody who's intersexual with their genitals, because that's we know that that was caused by biology. But what the point that I'm trying to get across here is for people who don't have empathy with maybe sexual orientation, it doesn't seem like that's so common anymore. Or transsexuality, like the Caitlyn Jenner, like, oh my gosh, how could Bruce Jenner, our hero from back in the day, how could he be like this? And I'm trying to show you that it's the same process. So if you can recognize that, oh, the genitals can be organized differently due to hormone levels, then maybe you can also say, oh, I get it. The hypothalamus, which controls who I'm attracted to, can also be altered by hormone levels that are kind of different. And the cortex, which is the outer covering of the brain, which is where our thinking process and how we define ourselves, it can also be organized by testosterone levels. And there can be differences, and there are differences. Like, the point that I'm trying to get across is like, there's so many different variables that we definitely don't have any specific